My name is Diana Hawthorne, and for the first 24 years of my life, I lived in a cage made of gold and silk. They hired a monster to protect me from a phantom, a man whose only crime was loving poetry more than profit, never once imagining that a real dragon was stirring in the shadows of my family's past. And in the end, that monster, the man they called the Beast, was the only thing I had left. Before I dive into the story of how the ugliest man I had ever seen taught me the true meaning of beauty, and how the most brutal man I had ever known showed me the power of gentleness, I want to connect with all of you listening right now. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel, and if you've ever felt trapped or misunderstood by the very people who were supposed to love you most, hit that like button. It helps to know we're not alone. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the perfectly manicured gardens and the suffocating silence of the Hawthorne estate. My world was one of inherited expectations. The Hawthorne name was a legacy built on shrewd investments and ruthless acquisitions, a dynasty my father, Marcus Hawthorne, presided over with the unyielding authority of a king. My mother Isabel was his queen, a woman whose grace was as sharp and polished as the diamonds she wore. To them I was the crown princess, an asset to be managed, polished, and eventually merged with another suitable dynasty through marriage. My feelings, my dreams, my very soul, these were irrelevant details in the grand tapestry of the Hawthorne legacy. I was to be beautiful, dutiful, and silent. For a long time I was. I learned to find solace in the quiet corners of our estate, the sprawling library with its scent of old paper and leather, and the glass conservatory, a humid green world teeming with life that asked for nothing but light and water. The trouble, as my parents saw it, began with Francis Davenport. I met him at a gallery opening, a charity event my mother insisted I attend. While everyone else was discussing the investment potential of the art, Francis was talking about the emotion in the brushstrokes. He was a poet, with kind eyes and a way of speaking that made the world seem less like a ledger and more like a song. He had no title, no portfolio, no name that carried any weight in the circles my parents moved in. He was, in their eyes, a phantom, a nobody. But to me he was a breath of fresh air in a suffocating room. We began to meet, secretly at first, in small cafes and quiet parks. He read me his poetry, and I told him about the rare orchids I was trying to cultivate in the conservatory. For the first time, I felt like someone was seeing Diana, not just the Hawthorne heiress. Of course, it couldn't last. My father had eyes and ears everywhere. One evening, he summoned me to his study. The room was dark, paneled in mahogany, smelling of expensive cigars and disappointment. He didn't yell. He never did. His voice was a cold, quiet instrument of control. "This dalliance with the poet ends," he said, not looking up from a stock report. "He is a distraction, unsuitable. He offers nothing." I tried to argue, to explain that he made me happy, a concept as foreign to my father as financial loss. "Happiness is a fleeting sentiment for commoners," he replied, finally meeting my gaze. "Security, legacy, that is what matters. You will cease this foolishness immediately." My mother was worse. She expressed her disappointment with a sigh that could curdle milk. "Diana, darling, think of the optics. A poet? People will think we've lost our minds, or our money." I was foolish enough to defy them. I continued to see Francis, my rebellion fueled by the quiet joy he brought me. That was my mistake. My parents did not believe in half measures. If I would not listen to reason, they would simply remove the possibility of choice. Their solution was announced a week later over a tense, silent dinner. "We've taken measures to ensure your focus remains where it should be," my father declared, placing his fork down with chilling precision. "We have hired a full-time personal security detail for you. He will be your constant companion." I pictured a man in a crisp suit with an earpiece. An inconvenience. I was not prepared for Elias Thorne. He arrived the next morning. The butler showed him into the grand foyer, and I came down the stairs to see him standing there, a mountain of a man who seemed to absorb all the light in the room. He was tall and broad, dressed in simple, severe black, but it was his face that made me stop dead on the third step. A thick, jagged scar ran from his left temple down across his cheek, pulling at the corner of his eye and his mouth, giving him a permanent, grim sneer. Another, older scar, pale and white, bisected his eyebrow. His nose had been broken, poorly set. His eyes were the color of slate, cold and flat, and they missed nothing. He was, without exaggeration, the most fearsome-looking man I had ever seen. He was a creature from a different world, a world of violence and pain. He looked at me and I felt a tremor of genuine fear. This was not a bodyguard. This was a cage in human form. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, and his voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together. "I am Elias Thorne." My father stepped forward, beaming with grim satisfaction. He clapped Elias on his formidable shoulder. "Mr. Thorne is a decorated war veteran," he announced to me, though his eyes were on Elias. "He will ensure no undesirable elements get too close." We thought his presence would be a rather effective deterrent. The message was clear. They had not hired a guard. They had hired a monster to stand at my shoulder, a beast whose brutish appearance was designed to scare everyone, especially a gentle poet, away. And for a time, I hated him for it. I hated him for the cage he represented, never realizing that he would one day be the only thing standing between me and the bars of a much more terrible one. The first few weeks with Elias Thorne were a masterclass in psychological warfare, and I was the sole target. He was a ghost in combat boots, a silent, brooding monolith who was everywhere and nowhere at once. If I went to the library, he would stand just outside the door, his massive frame blocking the light. If I walked in the gardens, he was 10 paces behind, his heavy tread a constant, unnerving rhythm against the gravel path. He never spoke unless spoken to, and his answers were clipped monosyllabic things. "Yes, miss," "No, miss," "Understood." He was a wall of scarred flesh and cold duty, and he succeeded in his mission with terrifying efficiency. My world, which had already felt small, shrank to the size of his shadow. My friends, accustomed to lunches filled with light gossip and laughter, fell silent under his unnerving gaze. They would stare at the brutal topography of his face, their words drying up. "Saria, darling, he's intense," one of them whispered to me over tea, her eyes wide as she watched Elias stand sentinel by the cafe window. Soon the invitations stopped coming. No one wanted to invite a storm cloud to their garden party. I was an island, and Elias Thorne was the treacherous rocky reef surrounding me, ensuring no ship could ever reach my shore. And then there was Francis. Bless his gentle, poetic heart, he tried. He appeared at the estate gates one afternoon, a bouquet of wild flowers in his hand. Elias met him there. I watched from an upstairs window as they spoke, though I could hear nothing. It wasn't necessary. I saw Francis's hopeful expression falter, then curdle into apprehension, then outright fear. Elias didn't move a muscle beyond speaking. He didn't threaten. He didn't have to. His very existence was a threat. The way he stood, his sheer, immovable mass, the dead emptiness in his eyes. It was enough. Francis took a step back, then another. He placed the flowers on the ground, turned and practically fled. He sent me a letter a few days later, a beautiful, tragic poem about a nightingale and a hawk, essentially ending things. My parents were ecstatic. Their plan had worked perfectly. I felt a hollow, bitter ache in my chest. I had lost my small rebellion, and now I was truly alone with the beast they had assigned to me. My resentment for Elias solidified into a cold, hard stone in my heart. He was the architect of my isolation, the living symbol of my parents' control. I began to push back in small, petty ways. I would change my mind at the last second, forcing him to trail me from one end of the estate to the other. I would ask him to retrieve books from the highest shelves, a task he performed with silent, infuriating competence. I would speak to him in French, knowing he likely wouldn't understand, a small, childish act of defiance. He never reacted. His composure was absolute, his professionalism a suit of armor I could not penetrate. He simply endured me, his stone-colored eyes watching my every move with that same unnerving stillness. The change came, as such things often do, not with a bang but with a whisper. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The rhythmic drumming of water against the glass panes of the conservatory was the only sound. This was my sanctuary, a place where I could coax life from dirt and seed, a world I could control in a life where I controlled nothing else. I was repotting a particularly delicate lady slipper orchid, a temperamental thing that was finally about to bloom. My mind was elsewhere, lost in a fog of loneliness and frustration. My hand slipped. The small terracotta pot tumbled from the bench, shattering on the stone floor. Soil and roots and the fragile green shoots spilled across the flagstones. I cried out, a small choked sound of dismay. It was a stupid, trivial thing, an overturned plant, but in that moment it felt like the breaking of the last good thing I had. I sank to my knees, my eyes blurring with tears, expecting to hear the heavy tread of my shadow approaching, expecting him to stand over me, impassive and judging. The footsteps came, but they were quieter than usual. I looked up through my tears and saw Elias kneeling opposite me. I flinched, anticipating an annoyed sigh or a brusque command to clean up the mess. Instead, what I saw stunned me into silence. His large, scarred hands, hands that looked like they were made for crushing stone, were moving with an impossible, breathtaking delicacy. He was gathering the spilled soil, his thick fingers gently separating the fine, web-like roots of the orchid from the sharp shards of terracotta. He handled the plant as if it were spun glass. There was a focus in his eyes I had never seen before, a quiet concentration that was almost reverent. He didn't look at me. He just worked, carefully salvaging my broken project. When he had gathered the plant, its roots now safely cradled in his palm, he looked around, his gaze landing on an empty pot nearby. With the same slow, deliberate care, he placed the orchid into its new home, tamping the soil around it with a touch that was lighter than my own. He then stood up, retrieved a small brush and dustpan from a nearby tool shed, and swept up the last of the mess. He did all of this without a single word. When he was finished, he looked at me, still kneeling on the floor. For the first time, the coldness in his slate eyes was gone, replaced by something I couldn't name. It wasn't pity, it was something closer to understanding. "It will survive," he said, his voice that same low rumble, but it sounded different now. "They're tougher than they look." He then resumed his post by the door, and the wall was back in place, but I had seen the crack. I had seen the man behind the monster. A man who knew that some things, though fragile, were tough enough to survive a fall. From that day on, something shifted inside me. My petty rebellion died, replaced by a cautious curiosity. The man my parents had hired to be a scarecrow had a soul. I started to see him, not as a symbol, but as a person. I began to test the waters, not with defiance, but with kindness. The next morning, when the maid brought my breakfast tray, I asked for an extra cup of black coffee and a plain scone. When Elias took up his position outside my sitting room, I opened the door and offered it to him. He stared at the cup and plate in my hand as if I were offering him a live scorpion. "It's not my job to feed you, Miss Hawthorne," he said, his voice stiff. "I know," I replied softly. "I just thought you might like it." I placed the tray on a small table near his post and retreated. For an hour it sat there untouched, but when I next glanced out, it was gone. It became a small, silent ritual. A cup of coffee in the morning, a glass of iced tea in the afternoon. I started leaving a bookmark in the novels I finished, placing them on the library table with a quiet, "I thought you might enjoy this one if you have the time." He never acknowledged the gestures directly, but the books always disappeared. One day I was in the garden, struggling to prune a climbing rose whose thorns were particularly vicious. I turned to get my thicker gloves, and when I turned back, Elias was there. He took the shears from my hand. "Allow me," was all he said. His scarred hands, so gentle with the orchid, were ruthlessly efficient with the overgrown bush, clipping away the dead wood with an expert's precision. He knew about plants. He knew about books. Layers were beginning to peel away from the monolith, revealing glimpses of the man beneath. I learned to read his silences. A slight tightening of his jaw meant he was annoyed, not at me, but at one of the gardeners leaving a tool where someone could trip. A fractional narrowing of his eyes meant he was assessing a perceived threat, which could be anything from a delivery van to a squirrel that was behaving erratically. I started talking to him, not expecting much of a reply. I told him about the history of the estate, about the ghost that was said to haunt the West Wing, about the trouble I was having with a Chopin nocturne on the piano. Most of the time he just listened, his expression unchanging, but I felt his attention. It was no longer the oppressive watchfulness of a jailer, it was the focused listening of someone who was actually hearing me. One afternoon, sitting on a bench overlooking the koi pond, I finally asked him, "Why did you take this job, Elias?" He was silent for a long moment, watching the orange and white fish drift through the murky water. I thought he wouldn't answer. "It's quiet," he finally said, the two words holding a universe of meaning. "And I'm good at it." He paused again, then added, so quietly I almost missed it. "And I needed a place where no one would ask questions about my face." The admission was so stark, so vulnerable, it stole my breath. Here was this terrifying man, a man who could break another in two, and he was hiding from the stares, the whispers, the judgment. My parents had hired him for his scars, seeing them as a tool. They never considered the pain that created them. In that moment, my heart ached for him. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had been through a war and was still fighting one inside himself. My parents saw him as a brutish success, their plan to isolate me working to perfection. They never once saw the quiet, fragile bridge of kindness being built between their daughter and the beast they had hired to keep her in her cage. They were blind, and their blindness was about to put us all in mortal danger. The first sign that a storm was gathering on the horizon came not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper on expensive stationery. A letter arrived from my father. I saw it on the hall table. The envelope was heavy cream stock, the address written in an elegant, sharp calligraphy. I thought nothing of it until I saw my father's face later that day. His usual commanding composure had been replaced by a thin, brittle anger. He was pacing in his study, a rare crack in his iron facade. He dismissed my questions with a wave of his hand. "Business nonsense, nothing that concerns you." But over the next few weeks, more letters arrived. The air in the house grew thick with unspoken tension. My father became short-tempered. My mother's smile grew more strained. They were closing ranks, shutting me out, treating the threat like a distasteful family secret. Elias noticed it too. His quiet vigilance intensified. He was no longer just watching me, he was watching everything. His eyes would sweep the grounds, linger on unfamiliar cars passing the gates, and track the movements of every staff member. He was a hunter who had scented a predator in his territory. The predator revealed himself at the annual Red Cross Gala, the pinnacle of the city's social calendar. My parents insisted I attend, a public display of the united, unbothered Hawthorne family. The ballroom was a sea of jewels and forced smiles. And in the middle of it all was Heath Blackwood. He was a striking man, the dark and polished inverse of Elias. He was handsome in a severe, predatory way, with black hair slicked back and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the light. He moved with the confident, fluid grace of a panther, and when he entered a room, people took notice. He was a rising power in the world of finance, known for his aggressive, almost brutal takeover strategies. My father's face went pale when he saw him. Blackwood made his way through the crowd directly to our table. He ignored my mother and me, his entire focus lasering in on my father. "Marcus," he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr. "How wonderful to see you. You're looking prosperous." The words were polite, but the tone was laced with venom. "It's been a long time. I trust you've been sleeping well." My father's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his champagne flute. "Blackwood, I wasn't aware you were back in the city." "Oh, I'm not just back," Blackwood replied, his smile never reaching his eyes. "I'm here to collect on an old family debt. Some things, you see, accrue interest over time." He finally glanced at me then, a flicker of assessment in his dark eyes, as if he were calculating my value. The look made my skin crawl. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he was gone, melting back into the crowd. The exchange lasted less than a minute, but the chill it left behind was profound. My parents were visibly shaken. I turned to look for Elias, who was standing against a far wall, his scarred face a mask of grim focus. He had watched the entire interaction, and I could see from the rigid set of his shoulders that he had recognized Blackwood for what he was, a wolf in $1,000 suit. That night, the quiet rhythm of our days was broken. Elias began using his own resources, making hushed calls to numbers I didn't recognize. He spent hours on a laptop in the small security office near the kitchen. He was no longer just a bodyguard, he was an intelligence operative. I finally confronted him a few days later in the library. "What is it, Elias? Who is that man?" He looked up from a book he wasn't reading, his gaze heavy. He was reluctant to frighten me, but he also knew I deserved more than my parents' dismissive lies. "Heath Blackwood," he said, his voice low. "His father was a man named Thomas Blackwood. He was your father's original business partner decades ago." He hesitated, choosing his words with care. "There was a disagreement, a hostile takeover. Thomas Blackwood lost everything, his company, his fortune, his reputation. He took his own life 6 months later." The story landed like a stone in my gut. This wasn't business, this was a blood feud. "Heath was just a boy," Elias continued. "He disappeared, raised by distant relatives. He spent the last 20 years rebuilding, getting strong, getting rich, all of it, I suspect, with one goal in mind. Revenge," I whispered. Elias nodded grimly. "He doesn't just want your father's money, he wants to dismantle his life, to take everything he values." His eyes met mine, and I understood the unspoken horror. Blackwood hadn't just been looking at me at the gala, he had been appraising me. I was the ultimate prize, my father's most cherished asset. Blackwood's plan wasn't just to ruin my family, it was to claim me as spoils of war. The vague threat had solidified into a terrifying, specific reality. Elias's next words were a solemn vow. "He will not touch you. I will not let him." The knowledge of this dark history changed everything. I began to see my father not as a powerful patriarch, but as a man haunted by the ghosts of his own ruthless ambition. His arrogance was a shield, and now it was putting us all in danger. His refusal to acknowledge the threat was a profound weakness. The tension in the house escalated. One afternoon I came across my mother in the drawing room, her composure finally shattered. She was weeping, a quiet, desperate sound. I tried to comfort her, but she pushed me away. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "That man, what your father did, we deserve this." It was the first time I had ever seen her as anything other than a perfect, polished queen, and the sight of her fear terrified me more than anything. The strain began to wear on me. The feeling of being watched, of waiting for an axe to fall, was a constant, crushing weight. One evening, after a particularly cutting argument with my father where he accused me of being hysterical, the pressure became too much. I fled to the conservatory. my chest tight, my breathing ragged. The humid air felt thick and suffocating. The walls of glass seemed to be closing in. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs, a classic panic attack. Though I didn't have a name for it then, I sank onto a bench, gasping for air, the world tilting around me. Elias found me moments later. I expected him to be awkward, to stand there in uncomfortable silence as I fell apart. Instead, he knelt in front of me, his voice calm and steady in the roaring chaos of my mind. "Diana, look at me." I forced my eyes to focus on his scarred face. "Breathe with me," he said. "In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. He exaggerated his own breathing, a slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his massive chest. I tried to follow, my own breath still ragged and shallow. "Good," he murmured. "Again, focus on the sound. Just the sound of your own breathing. Find it." He wasn't talking to me like an heiress or a client. He was talking to me like a soldier on the battlefield, calming a comrade whose nerve had broken. "Name 5 things you can see," he commanded gently. The orchid," I stammered. "The glass. Your hands. The stone floor. The watering can." "Good. 4 things you can feel. The bench. My dress. The humidity. My hands are cold. 3 things you can hear. My breathing. The fountain outside. Your voice." He continued the exercise until the world slowly stopped spinning, until the frantic drummer in my chest began to slow its beat. When I could finally breathe again, I looked at him, my eyes filled with tears of gratitude. He had anchored me. He had pulled me back from the edge. "How did you know how to do that?" I asked, my voice shaky. He looked away, a flicker of old pain in his eyes. "We learned to look after our own," he said simply. "Some wars aren't fought on a battlefield." It was a moment of profound intimacy, a sharing of scars seen and unseen. He was no longer just my protector, he was my anchor. My father, however, saw Elias's diligence as a threat to his own authority. He summoned Elias to his study a few days later. Not knowing they were there, I was passing in the hall when I heard my father's voice, raised and sharp with anger. I stopped, pressing myself against the wall to listen. "Your job is to guard my daughter, Thorne, not to conduct your own private investigations," my father snapped. "Heath Blackwood is my concern. I have lawyers, I have connections, I will handle him." "With respect, Mr. Hawthorne," Elias's deep voice was dangerously calm. "Blackwood isn't a man who respects lawyers, he respects force, he is a predator, and he is circling this house. You are underestimating him." "And you are overstepping your bounds," my father roared. "I hired you for your appearance, for your reputation. I hired a guard dog, not an advisor. You will stand at the gate, look menacing, and keep your mouth shut. That is what I pay you for. Do you understand me?" The silence that followed was heavy and terrifying. I could feel Elias's fury, his discipline, his restraint, all warring with each other. "I understand," he finally said, his voice clipped and devoid of all emotion. He exited the study moments later, his face a mask of stone. He saw me in the hall, and his eyes met mine. In them, I saw the full depth of his frustration and my father's catastrophic pride. In that moment, I knew with chilling certainty that my father would not save us. He was too arrogant to see the truth. The only person who would, the only person who could, was the scarred and broken man he had just insulted. The beast was my only hope. Heath Blackwood grew tired of the game, the letters, the veiled threats. They were the prelude, the slow tightening of the snare before the final brutal snap. The attack came on a Thursday night, a night so thick with fog it felt like the world had been wrapped in damp cotton. My parents had retired early, the strain of the preceding weeks finally catching up to them. I was in the library, a book open in my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in an hour. Elias was where he always was, a silent sentinel in the hall, his stillness more comforting to me now than any spoken reassurance. The first sign that something was wrong was a flicker of the lights, a brief stuttering dimming that made the hair on my arms stand up. Then the entire estate plunged into darkness. Before I could even draw a breath to scream, Elias was in the room, moving with a speed and silence that was terrifying for a man his size. He had a powerful flashlight in one hand and a cold, grim certainty in his eyes. "They've cut the main power line," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "The backup generator should have kicked in. It didn't. They've disabled it. The phone lines are dead. Stay behind me." His words were calm, clinical, the voice of a soldier assessing a combat situation. My panic, which had been rising in my throat, receded in the face of his absolute control. He was not afraid, and because he was not afraid, I found a sliver of courage within myself. The sound came next, the distant shattering of glass from the ground floor, somewhere in the east wing. They were inside. "The study," Elias commanded. "It has solid oak doors and only one window facing the sheer cliff. It's the most defensible room in the house." He guided me through the darkened hallways, his hand a firm, reassuring weight on my shoulder. We found my parents in the upstairs hall, my father in a silk dressing gown, his face ashen, my mother clutching his arm, her eyes wide with terror. All their wealth, their power, their influence, it had evaporated into nothing in the face of a broken window and the darkness. "What is happening?" my father demanded, his voice a pathetic, shaky whisper. "We are under attack, Mr. Hawthorne," Elias said, his tone flat, without a trace of "I told you so." "Follow me, now." He led us to the study and locked the heavy door behind us. He pushed my father's massive mahogany desk in front of it, creating a formidable barricade. "Stay here, away from the door," he ordered. He looked at me, his eyes locking with mine in the beam of his flashlight. "Diana, do you remember the old service bell system, the wires in the walls?" I nodded, my mind racing. "It was an archaic system, disconnected decades ago. The wires for the east wing run through the chimney flue in this room," he said. "They connect to the main panel in the cellar. The panel has its own battery. If you can reconnect the wire, you can ring the bell in the gatehouse. The guard there has a separate radio." It was a desperate 1,000,000 to 1 chance. "I'll keep them busy," he said, and the finality in his tone sent a shard of ice through my heart. He was preparing to fight them all, alone. Before I could protest, he was gone, slipping out a side door that led to a narrow service corridor, melting into the shadows of the house he had memorized. The next hour was a blur of fragmented terror. We heard them in the house, the heavy footsteps, the splintering of wood as they broke down doors, the low voices communicating with brutal efficiency. My father was useless, a whimpering mess huddled in a corner. My mother was frozen, staring at the barricaded door. It was me who found the old fireplace, who pried open the flue and, after several agonizing minutes of fumbling in the dark, found the thin, cloth-wrapped wire Elias had described. While they searched for us, I worked, my fingers raw, my mind focused on the single task he had given me. I heard the sounds of the fight. It wasn't loud, not like in the movies. It was a series of sickening wet thuds, grunts of pain, and the crash of furniture. Elias wasn't fighting like a hero. He was hunting. He was using the darkness, the familiar terrain, the element of surprise. He was turning our home into a trap. I finally managed to strip the wire and jam it into the ancient terminal, praying he was right. I pulled the cord again and again, sending a desperate, silent plea for help out into the foggy night. The noises grew closer. They had found our general location. A massive impact shook the main door, splintering the frame. My father cried out. Another crash, and the desk shuddered, scraping against the floor. They were coming through. Just as a third, final impact shattered the lock and the door began to swing inward, a new sound cut through the night, the rising, frantic wail of a distant siren. The bell had worked, help was coming. But it was still miles away. The door flew open. A man stood there, silhouetted, a weapon in his hand. Before he could step inside, he was violently yanked backward, a dark shape moving out of the shadows. It was Elias. He was a whirlwind of brutal motion. The fight in the hallway was short, savage, and final. Then silence. Footsteps approached the doorway again. This time it was Heath Blackwood. He was immaculate, untouched by the violence, a faint, cruel smile on his lips. Behind him, two more of his men stood ready. Elias appeared in the doorway opposite him, a dark, avenging angel. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. His breathing was labored, but he stood as solid and immovable as a mountain. The guard dog, Blackwood, sneered. Impressive. But you're just a man, and you're outnumbered. Give me the girl, and I will let you live. Elias didn't answer. He just took a half step forward, placing himself squarely between Blackwood and us. I see, Blackwood said with a sigh. A pity. He nodded to his men. They charged. The ensuing battle was the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. Elias was no longer just a man. He was a force of nature, a cornered beast, fighting with primal fury and cold tactical precision. He used everything, a heavy lamp, the leg of a broken table, his own body as a weapon. He moved through the violence with a grim purpose, absorbing blows that would have felled a lesser man, and repaying them with devastating efficiency. He took one man down, then the other, but he was slowing, the injuries taking their toll. He and Blackwood circled each other in the ruined hallway. Blackwood, for all his polish, was a fighter, fast and vicious. He lunged, a knife appearing in his hand. Elias deflected, but the blade sliced deep into his arm. He grunted in pain but didn't retreat. He fought on, his loyalty, his vow to me, fueling him beyond normal human limits. He finally saw an opening. He lunged, not away from the knife, but toward it, allowing the blade to sink into his non-vital shoulder to close the distance. He trapped Blackwood's arm, and with a final, desperate surge of strength, he slammed Blackwood into the wall. The sound of the impact echoed through the house as Blackwood crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Elias stood over him, swaying, his chest heaving, blood dripping from a dozen wounds onto the priceless Persian rug. The sirens were deafening now, red and blue lights flashing through the windows. The siege was over. He turned and looked at me, his slate-colored eyes finding mine in the chaos. He gave a single slow nod, as if to say, "You are safe," and then his legs gave out, and he collapsed. I screamed his name and rushed to his side, my parents forgotten, the world shrinking to the sight of the fallen monster who had just saved us all. The immediate aftermath was a cacophony of sirens, shouting men in police uniforms, and the crunch of broken glass underfoot. Paramedics swarmed the hallway, their movements efficient and urgent. I refused to leave Elias's side. I knelt on the ruined rug, holding pressure on the worst of his wounds as I had seen in movies, my hands stained with his blood. He was semi-conscious, his breathing shallow, his scarred face pale beneath the blood and grime. I remember seeing my father step forward, looking down at Elias with a strange expression of awe and horror, as if seeing this man for the first time. The brute he had hired, the guard dog, had just sacrificed himself to protect the very family that saw him as little more than a piece of menacing furniture. At the hospital, the sterile white environment was a jarring contrast to the violent chaos of our home. They rushed Elias into surgery. I was left in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and anxiety. My parents arrived shortly after, wrapped in blankets provided by the police, looking small and lost. My mother tried to pull me into an embrace. "Diana, thank God you're safe," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My entire being was focused on the closed doors of the operating theater. My safety felt secondary. All I could think about was the man who had insured it. "They say he will be all right," my father said. his voice uncharacteristically subdued. The doctors are optimistic. He's a remarkably tough man. There was a new respect in his tone, but it was too little too late. He paced the small room, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I will compensate him, of course. Handsomely. He'll never have to work another day in his life. The offer, which would once have been the ultimate solution in my father's world, now sounded hollow and insulting. Elias hadn't fought for money, he had fought for me. The surgeon came out hours later. He told us Elias was stable. The knife wound to his shoulder was deep but had missed the artery. He had a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a litany of cuts and bruises. He was alive. The relief that washed over me was so profound it left me weak. I insisted on seeing him. The nurses were hesitant, but I was immovable. They finally led me to a private room in the recovery ward. He was asleep, dwarfed by the hospital bed despite his size. An IV line snaked into his arm. The harsh hospital lights seemed to soften the scars on his face, making him look younger, more vulnerable. I sat in the chair beside his bed and watched him breathe. I didn't leave that chair for 2 days. I slept there. I ate the terrible hospital food there, and I read aloud from a book of poetry I'd had in my purse, hoping the sound of my voice might reach him. He woke on the 3rd day. His slate eyes fluttered open, hazy with pain and medication. They found me, and a flicker of confusion crossed his face. "Diana," he rasped, his voice hoarse, "you're still here." "Of course I'm here," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't going to leave you." He tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "My job is done. Blackwood is in custody." "This wasn't about your job, Elias, and you know it," I said, placing a gentle hand on his uninjured arm. "You could have been killed. Why?" He was silent for a long time, staring at the ceiling. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "In my old life, we had a code. You don't leave your people behind, ever." "Was I your people?" I asked. His eyes met mine, and in their depths I saw the truth he had never spoken. "You were the first person in a very long time," he said, "who looked at my face and wasn't afraid. You saw a man, not a monster. You treated me with kindness. I had forgotten what that felt like." He looked away, a faint flush rising on his neck. "Kindness is a debt I take seriously." My father came to visit the next day. He stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed, a humbled, diminished version of the corporate titan I had always known. "Thorne," he began, his voice strained, "we owe you a debt that can never be repaid. I was a fool, arrogant. I misjudged you, and I misjudged the danger." He pulled a checkbook from his jacket. "Name your price, anything. A blank check, a house, whatever you want, it's yours." Elias slowly shook his head, the movement pained. "I don't want your money, Mr. Hawthorne." "Then what do you want?" my father asked, bewildered. Elias looked past him, his gaze settling on me. "I've already been paid," he said quietly. My father looked from Elias to me, and for the first time a flicker of true understanding dawned in his eyes. He saw the bond that had formed right under his nose, a bond forged not of wealth or status, but of quiet kindness and shared humanity. He saw that the most valuable thing in his life had been protected by a man who operated on a currency my father had never learned to value. He put his checkbook away, nodded once to Elias, and left the room a profoundly changed man. The news confirmed that Heath Blackwood and his crew would face a long list of federal charges, from kidnapping to assault. The Hawthorne name was secure, the fortune intact, but the foundation of our family, built on pride and control, had been shattered forever. And in its ruins, I knew I had to build something new for myself. The weeks after the attack were a period of strange, quiet transformation. Our house, once a symbol of impenetrable security and status, now felt like a gilded cage with broken bars. Repair crews moved through the halls, replacing shattered windows and patching bullet holes in the plaster, but they couldn't fix the broken sense of safety. My parents walked on eggshells around me. They had seen their daughter nearly abducted, and their world had tilted on its axis. Their attempts to reconnect were clumsy. My mother bought me extravagant gifts I didn't want. My father tried to discuss my future, suggesting a long trip to Europe, anything to escape the memory of what had happened. But I didn't want to escape. I wanted to confront. My confrontation with them wasn't angry or tearful. It was quiet, resolute, and it took place in the same study where my father had declared his dominance over my life just weeks before. "I'm not going to Europe," I told them, "and I won't be living here anymore." My mother gasped. My father stared at me, his face impassive, but I could see the shock in his eyes. "I love you both," I said, and it was true, in a complicated, wounded way, "but I can't live under the weight of your expectations anymore." That night, it taught me what's real and what isn't. Legacy, appearances, strategic marriages, none of it matters when you are fighting for your life. Kindness matters, loyalty matters, courage matters. I took a deep breath. I'm going to start living a life that reflects those values. My values. They didn't argue. The fight had gone out of them. They had almost lost me, and in that terror their need for control had finally been broken by a desperate parental love they had forgotten how to show. Elias was released from the hospital a week later, his arm in a sling, his body still a canvas of purple and yellow bruises. He returned to the estate to collect his things, his intention to disappear as quietly as he had arrived. I found him in his small room in the staff quarters, packing a single duffel bag. The room was sparse, clinical, a reflection of the man he tried to be. "So that's it?" I asked from the doorway. "You're just leaving?" He turned, his movements stiff. "My contract is fulfilled. You are safe. There is no reason for me to stay." "Give me one reason to let you go," I challenged him softly. He looked at me, his slate eyes searching my face. "I am a bodyguard, Diana. You no longer require one. My presence would be inappropriate." "You are so much more than that, and you know it," I said, stepping into the room. "You're the man who knew how to save a broken orchid, the man who reads classic literature, the man who calmed my panic and stood against an army for me. I am no longer a person who needs a bodyguard, Elias. But I think I would very much like a friend, and maybe in time, more." The hope in my voice was terrifying and exhilarating. I was laying my heart bare to this scarred, broken, beautiful man. A slow, sad smile touched his lips, a sight so rare it was like watching a solar eclipse. "I am not a simple man, Diana. I am not like the men you know. I carry a war with me everywhere I go." "So do I now," I replied. "Maybe we can learn to carry them together." He didn't leave that day. He stayed, and we began the slow, careful process of building something new. I used a portion of my trust fund, much to my father's surprise, not to buy jewels or couture, but to establish a foundation dedicated to helping veterans transition back to civilian life, providing therapy, job training, and a sense of community. Elias, with his first-hand knowledge, became its first and most crucial advisor. We moved out of the grand, cold estate and into a smaller, warmer house with a large garden. Months later, the physical scars had faded, both his and mine. The emotional ones remained, but they were no longer raw, open wounds. They were part of who we were. I found him one afternoon in the garden of our new home. He wasn't standing guard, he was on his knees in the dirt, his scarred hands, which I had once feared, gently tending to a bed of fragile new seedlings. He looked up as I approached, and the look in his eyes was one of pure, unguarded peace. He had finally found a place where he didn't have to fight. The beast my father had hired to keep me caged had become the man who helped me find my freedom. And I, the girl who was supposed to be a fragile porcelain doll, had found strength in loving a man the world saw as a monster. We had saved each other. Looking back on it all now, it's incredible how my family's attempt to control my life backfired so spectacularly and in the end so beautifully. They thought a man's worth was in his bank account and his appearance, and they brought in a man they considered the lowest of the low to prove their point. But Elias Thorne taught all of us that true worth is measured in loyalty, courage, and the quiet strength it takes to be gentle in a brutal world. The greatest lesson I learned is that sometimes the things that seem ugliest on the surface hide the most profound beauty within, and the cages we find ourselves in are often of our own making, and the key to unlocking them isn't found in defiance but in connection. I would love to hear from you all. Has there ever been someone in your life who completely defied your first impression of them? Share your story in the comments below. I read as many as I can. It's stories like these that remind us to look deeper, beyond the surface. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more stories about finding strength in the most unexpected places. And if you know someone who might be feeling a little lost or judged, share this with them. You never know who might need to hear it. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. Remember that the deepest scars can lead to the strongest hearts, and that true family is defined by the love we build, not the blood we share.